Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also to the Pontifical Academy for inviting me to come and talk to you today about a subject which is very pertinent and interesting. I feel I'm beginning a constitutional journey from a green and pleasant land of William Shakespeare to a destination that is yet to be fully determined. So you have to bear with me that I may not know the conclusions, but I may be able to give you a sense of what the journey may mean. My starting point is historical, to begin with a question about the origins of the English nation, trace this development through the progression we call empire, and evaluate what are the characteristics that emerged from that time that today inform us in terms of national sovereignty, the role of our courts in terms of the rule of law, and also why these are pertinent to the core of the paper, which is the question of immigration. It defines us in terms of how others are defined by us. And therefore, in a sense, it exposes all the threads, the differences of opinion, the different currents of conflict between what is and what is not British. Our beginning, it is, I think, appropriate with Pope Gregory the Great, for it was he who identified I think it was a misunderstanding of the word angels, but it came across as angles. You know, true English identity is important. The reason it's important is because myth and mythology have surrounded the notion of uniqueness. We are, as humans to God, unique individuals. But as a nation, to proclaim uniqueness is to distinguish us as a superior being to others. And that notion of superiority goes against the facts. Often the facts are embedded in historical accounts. On pages 2 and 3, I show some of those examples of accounts that are historically based on records and artifacts have become more reliable than the accounts delivered by historians with a particular perception of what it is to be British or a particular analysis of what they want to say. What is clear is that we are, in England, an amalgam of different parts. That is to say, there are Anglo-Saxon tribes mixed with bits of Roman occupation and, of course, a Gaelic tradition. That Celtic tradition is very much part of the four nations that comprise the United Kingdom. As with most nations, external trade, war and conquest, assimilation and diaspora defines what we are in terms of our common elements. One point to make is about St. Augustine, for it was he who founded a cathedral and an adjoining king's school. Why do I mention that? I think what I'm trying to give you are the pillars of what we might call the state. That is to say, religion and its part it plays in society through education. The King's School is one of the oldest institutions in Britain, variously described in terms of public school, meaning, of course, private today, but connoting the notion of an ecclesiastical past with a present-day existence. But we must not forget this period because it does establish monarchy as, without doubt, unquestionably, the continuity of our constitution. Yes, you're right, we had an interruption with Cromwell, but the restoration proved more important than that interruption because it created a parliamentary system of which the Queen today is its head. And that notion of crown, symbolic of nation, but also underpinning our legislation, and we still call our judges Her Majesty's judges, as we do the Crown in Parliament. But there's another added addition to this story. It's the essence of sovereignty, variously defined by great philosophers, but it was Thomas Hobbes who, in its simplicity, identified the elements that we will look at later on in the paper. A body of men whose commands are laws. Notice the word men. Women were not regarded as part of the lawmaking process, and it took some time for men and women to be given equal voting rights. But nonetheless, the notion of command and law is intrinsic to our Constitution, as is the nation itself. before departing the platform of historical foundations, I think I should also mention an important but often overlooked thought. Pax Britannica, on page 5 of my paper, is a notion of converting English as a God-given language or a God-given people with self-belief in the authority of law and morality. Those are contested values today, undoubtedly, but they established without doubt the unquestionable truth that lay at the heart of what we now call the Westminster model of government. And that is important because it became a very handy way of exporting what we call the English model of constitutional law. And on page 6, I outline how empire became an important part of what we do. But before we go to empire itself, we should not overlook the contested history of the four nations that comprise England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. If you enter the House of Parliament, you will see the emblems of each of the four nations at each part of the symmetry of the ceiling of the Portcullis House, but also inside the older part of Westminster Hall. The symbolism was to bring together four different distinct nations under one law. This became a long history of contest and perhaps you might argue, in the end, conquest, where in the end what came about was a unified parliament. That is clear. There is only one parliament within the four nations. But outside that four parliament, there are national identities and autonomies which are recognized in each of the borders that surround each of the national nations themselves. There is a curiosity which I think must be not forgotten. Given the nature of having to form a union, would it not have been sensible to have called it a federal system? Federalism has much to commend it, and as you will see on pages 7 through to 11, I look at the different discussions of federalism. Alas and alack, it did not take root in the United Kingdom. The reasons, I think, are neatly summarized in this way. I think federalism became part of an identity that followed when the empire, having been gained, was very quickly relinquished in the period in the 19th century. And it was not inevitable that federalism would have been rejected. But sadly for the British, I think, it was too easily connected with the notion of republicanism, which of course was anti-monarchical, associated with countries that had gone through revolution. But also there was a sense, and I put it in plain language, federalism was good enough for the colonies, but perhaps not quite up to the sovereign God-given Parliament of the United Kingdom. I think there were many movements that came close to articulating the arguments about federalism, but it did not take place in any rational way because it became a contested part of the identity, in particular with the Irish. As you probably know, and this is the subject of a separate paper I've done for the Academy, which I will submit later, I thought it was better to look at the Irish issue in terms of Brexit separately. But in that paper, I explain how the 1920 model of devolved government came about in Northern Ireland and how, in fact, it was an attempt to have a devolved system rather than a federal system. So that's something you may want to question me on later. I now come to the crux of national identity. Isn't it strange that the initial idea of Britishness and empire were intertwined? And isn't it strange that the colonial past created a commonwealth of nations, which by definition suggests equality of opportunity and equal treatment? And initially, that idea of equality of opportunity and equal treatment took root. But sadly, intervening was the notion that somehow or other, Britishness was not quite the same if you came from an African identity, Indian identity, or from another part of the, what we might call empire. It
being the case that the empire was being, as it were, disaggregated into its different parts. There was, however, a lurking worry that somehow the national identity, which is English, might be diluted by the national identity of others. You know, fear is a very powerful stimulus to irrationality over logic. And in this respect, I think it's probably the French Revolution that taught us about the terror of fear, because it was soon after that the Aliens Act concept in 1793 took root, which was to suggest that outside the law, which we call criminal, were people who are not quite us, however we define us. And my exegesis on pages 11 onwards is really a sad story, I think, of a purpose that is served through immigration, which is welcome and, of course, welcoming in terms of economic development, diversity, but also sharing of values. And after the Second World War, it is quite clear the various bits of legislation that were passed, notably the Nationality Act of 1948, while it created a new category of citizens of the United Kingdom, it did so in a way that was adapted and pragmatically used. Why? Because after the war, we needed many new people to come and do the jobs that were needed to build a new future. And the Commonwealth countries willingly migrated in their numbers, and I think were generally welcomed. But it must not be forgotten that this was a small part of a larger picture. They were welcome to the point that they were already a source of economic well-being. But once it became apparent that their success may or might overwhelm the national population, they were regarded with fear. And sadly, our society became worse for that. It took a number of attempts through the Race Relations Act, I well remember them, to finally nail the lie that discrimination on the grounds of race was not just immoral and wrong, as well as uneconomic. It was also something that the state should not tolerate if it was truly to be under the notion of the sovereignty of Parliament on the one hand, but the rule of law on the other. This brings me to a recent example, which is both contemporary but at the same time alarming. 70 years ago, a ship, Empire SS Windrush, arrived with large numbers of Caribbean people. They were welcomed because they were seen as British and they were seen as necessary to the future of the well-being of the United Kingdom. Many came without documentation or accreditation, and they were not looked upon with much degree of detail or inspection or documentation itself. Truthfully, they had rights of residence, but those rights of residence were on paper and in theory rather than in practice. Legal rules require evidence, affidavits, birth certificates, and so on. These people did not have this. They were not asked to bring them, nor were they expected to give them at that time. But they entered in good faith, only to be revealed over a number of years to have in fact become stateless. They were not recognized within the legal system as being citizens because they lacked the documentation. They entered what is now described as a hostile environment, a policy that itself seems so anti the notion of the rule of law. But many were deported. Many stayed under the scene that is the civilized society. They did not vote because they could not register, they could not work in legitimate work, and so to a large extent they were exploited. My paper shows in great detail, pages 13 through to 16 and 17, how indeed all these problems were embedded in the very system that was there to protect them, the law. The law altered the rules and occasionally tweaked them in favor of an analysis of immigration that was often an opinion entered by the government rather than based on policy and evidence. And it continues today that many, many people are in the UK contributing taxes and so on, but are not able necessarily to become full parts of the United Kingdom if it appears that they are in fact European Union citizens, because they may have the right to remain or the right of abode, but they do not have the qualification that has now been introduced, and I want to talk about, namely the qualification of settled status. That qualification is an invention of recent times, but is a sign which I think is fundamental to this whole analysis, that citizenship may define you in law, but it is in fact about a relationship between people that are already there and people that are coming. And the question is, are they in fact compatible? And our system has found that compatibility to be based not on moral discussion or evidential rules, but more on opinions of politicians. I think this brings me to page 17. And there I look at the question of what Brexit and the nation state may engage in. My thesis so far is that the United Kingdom seems a relatively generous place to visit, provided you have citizenship and provided you have the right to remain. Insofar as there was a consensus about our joining the European community in 1972, that consensus has now been questioned by the recent referendum. And what that question did was open up another question, not the one that was asked about the European Union, but the Union of the United Kingdom. And I think no one realized that that was a question that may in fact have as much to do with our constitutional settlement as Brexit will be in our future relationship with the EU. Namely, the United Kingdom is made up of parts that did not vote to leave. Scotland did not vote to leave, Northern Ireland did not vote to leave, and parts of London, indeed the majority in the capital, did not vote to leave. And that, I think, questions the very nature of a union between the different nations and the perception of what it is to be a citizen in each. It is clear that one motivation that may in fact have transferred tacit support to the European Union to active engagement against it is the economic well-being of those that voted. And those that voted to leave did so for the understandable argument that they felt no part of the whole and did not share in the wealth of the nation. And that economic separation is as much a fault of the architectural design of the United Kingdom as it is of the European Union's ability to deal with structural funds in different parts. So if you look on page 17, I explain in some detail the challenge that we now have of converting our visitors from the EU who assumed that they had the right to remain. They do, but it is now time dated because they have to get a settled status, and my paper puts it very clearly that that will require an enormous amount of effort on their part to prove that they have a work experience, that they've got the proper documentation and so on. In fact, it is a clear indication that the more educated will be able to stay and the less educated or IT savvy will be asked to leave. There's no question of that. And those that are disabled or to some extent slightly impaired in different ways will find it even more difficult to cope with the pressures put upon them. My argument comes to a crux in this sense, that I think we have a contested set of values that has always been part of the United Kingdom, but for the first time, maybe in recent history certainly, has become more open and transparent. In other words, the sovereignty of one parliament, which, as it were, managed to accumulate the good respect of different parts of each nation, no longer stands up to the binary question that was asked, leave or stay. Some have said leave, some have said stay. And the result of that is that we have a cacophony of noise in trying to work out where we move to and why we should do it in a particular way. And I think in a way that reflects on the question about what it is that makes a union and what makes it successful. And insofar as an educated elite can inform and can counsel and advise, clearly that has failed. And going back to our very early point of the journey, which was this moment when St. Augustine came with Christianity and the educational school, it is also, to me, a reflection in a failure of education in our institutions at every level to ensure that citizenship was taught that included our neighbours in Europe as well as the rest of the world. On page 19, I very gently look at some aspects of the question about Northern Ireland, the single market, the withdrawal agreement. Much of this is technically difficult, but the gist of it is this. In order to secure a frictionless border, which is the intention, we have to consider how two elements of membership of the EU will be compatible, namely a customs union and a single market. And at the time of writing, it's very unclear that that can be resolved in the way that everyone will be happy about. There's another casualty in this, which I touch on page 21. It is this: in a non-written constitution, the problem that faces MPs is that in the values of what they share with their electorate and the mandate they receive, there is a conflict between their individual conscience in terms of their voting and what perceived to be the delivery of an outcome which may or may not fit with either their electorate or indeed their conscience, or indeed both. This is putting it as simply as I can, but let me assure you that the UK's sovereign parliament, in terms of an elected government and representation, is in some difficulty at reconciling, on the one hand, a referendum result, marginal but nevertheless clear in its outcome, with the mandate that is historically given to MPs in terms of their values and principles. And the irreconcilability of those two ideas has left us with a constitutional problem. We have not yet found a way of resolving it. Similarly, there is something else, and it's in paragraph in the middle of the page of 21, the worrying aspects, I call it, of Brexit legislation. Well, I write this very carefully. Worrying aspects, what do I mean? Let me be clear. It is obviously the case that ministerial power has increased and is increasing when we leave the EU than it has been up to date. In terms of the legislative timetable, the Withdrawal Act of 2018 is an exercise of accretion of power to one element of the executive as against the parliamentary accountability of the other parts of our constitution. This is alarming. It allows what we call Henry VIII powers to be exercised by ministers under very little scrutiny. It allows skeleton bills to be passed without primary legislation in the traditional three-stage votes in each house. It allows statutory instruments to dominate and even replace, dare I say it, primary law. The question is, will this uphold the rule of law? And is it possible for us to survive the outcome? Well, I draw together some concurrent issues and dilemmas on pages 22 and 23. The issues and dilemmas are about the question of recalibrating the status and rights of citizens. Left to its own devices, the UK government will do as it customarily has done, which is to seek the economic answer by limiting or increasing immigration. The concomitant effect of that is to leave many people uncertain, but also to not enter the moral issues of what a society that is one of the 5th largest in the world in terms of its economy should do for the rest of the world. What duties do we have? What obligations shall we continue to foster? All of this is not necessarily going to be changed by leaving the EU alone, but the direction of travel requires us to think very carefully about where we go and where we get that moral, as it were, compass. The omens are not good. The Windrush generation is a tip of an iceberg. As I left the United Kingdom a few days ago, I was told by many that the next Windrush scandal is the number of students that have been deported from the country because they allegedly failed a test for their English language competencies. And this has come to light as a real problem in terms of our immigration rules. Conclusions are these, and this, I think, goes to the hub of the problem. Sovereignty to us has always rested on the accompanying principle of upholding the rule of law. And yes, you probably are right that between the two, in a competition, the rule of law often gives rise to a weakness compared to the strength of sovereignty. But at the same time, our parliamentary tradition has often had the ability, not always, but occasionally, to exercise the checks and balances that are necessary to make us a democracy that takes account of the views of others. That democracy is pinned together on the notion that we respect our differences and understand that differences do not necessarily mean a binary choice between good and bad. In other words, the politics of the day can easily sensationalize the answer. If we go back to on page 24, I make this point, that as David Cannadine, a very influential historian at Cambridge, put it, Britain achieved the notion in their mind that they had achieved the finest civilization in the globe. That was the challenge, that they put themselves and they felt they'd achieved it. He equally explains that despite all of that achievement, there was a sense of insecurity, a sense of inexactitude about what it is that had been achieved, or indeed if it had been worth the effort. In that respect, we go back to some of our worst moments in our history, when Enoch Powell famously talked about the rivers of blood and put fear into many citizens about what he thought the British society would end up looking like. What I'm saying is that the omens that suggest that that threat, that worry, that fear is with us are represented in the Hansard Society's recent report of 2019. Alarmingly, it notes public despairing and confidence in the political system. But even more alarming is the notion that a more authoritarian approach to governing would in fact be appropriate or would be suitable. This is dangerous. We have, as a very famous writer, Tamir, said, we have to recognize that democracy and liberalism can turn nasty and morbid unless it is brought together in a spirit of compromise and understanding. And this leaves me with my last thought. We have no roadmap that took the journey this afternoon down the road to a potentially post-Brexit society, because there was no roadmap for Brexit. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is we are slightly adrift at a moment when we need ideas and inspiration. If we look at the UK's constitution in 1688, there were new ideas, and there was a new world created by our parliamentary structures and institutions. Those institutions are themselves at the heart of what many people regard as the problem, not the solution. And as such, we look not a society of green and pleasant land, a society of harmony and mutual recognition, and we call compromise or pragmatism, as you might call it in the French sense, we look more fractured and deeply divided than perhaps at any time in our future. And I suggest that we have to remedy these defects before they become too permanent. Thank you.